down and all around.
In other words,
I saw where the administration is that really that's kind of scary right after an election.
Realtor stuff.
I know it's on the list of projects.
Right there.
Absolutely. Hey, David, you're seeing it. Hey, yes, you did. You told me. I talked to her pretty good. Get on the ball.
And as you know, I talked to you about you must have Teresa probably.
Yeah, okay. Teresa did a great job.
I mean, you didn't have it, but we might be.
Obviously, this week's holiday, next week's back. We're on vacation. Another big.
Well, you're on vacation. I don't know about you, but I'll find
I went up to the mountains. This one, went up to the mountains in June for about 6 days. And the girls are at that age they're trying to get away. But it takes them. I've got 5 girls and 2 girls, and they'll both just want to ride. Well, they're not
you know what it's so like me.
Oh, yeah. Love that, man. These guys are messing around.
Let's do that. I'll give you a call right after you're down here. Slippery needles all the way around.
We usually find, I think,
Hi, we're gonna get started. Come on in and have a seat.
that was just a one-time thing. They're not going to do that every year.
They got 3-year contracts. This is 7 hours and they're trying to get it.
Well, good morning. Thank you all so much for coming today. John DiDomizio is the chairman of our Transportation and Infrastructure Committee here at the Chamber. So I'm going to turn all of this over to you, John.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome, everybody.
I really appreciate everybody coming today. We've had a lot of events this last few weeks, and I've seen many of you at a lot of those events. But I do appreciate you coming. I think clearly our Transportation Infrastructure Committee is all about the topic that we're going to be discussing today. I mean, certainly we know that private investment does follow public investments in infrastructure. That's a given, and the important part is directing those investments, public investments, in such a way that optimizes that investment in the private sector. And we've got two people with us today that have been very involved on this topic. And first one is Alex Hergott. He's going to be talking here in a minute about some of the things going on at national level from the chamber, U.S. Chamber's perspective. Of course, our own Congressman Bucshon was on the House Transportation Committee, a very important post, and was very involved in working out the details of the legislation that led to the MAP 21 bill that was passed and signed by the President in early July. A very key start to getting a longer-term plan for transportation. And of course, the key part of that was the retaining the flexibility and moving towards allowing more flexibility in funding how projects are funded in the future. Certainly, we have a lot of very large-scale projects here in the 8th District that are absolutely essential to us long-term. And we've been spending a lot of time talking about that, but the types of things that we're going to be talking about today, we're going to try and do this somewhat informally, not real formal. And I thought, as we do in every Transportation Infrastructure Committee meeting, again, I appreciate everybody coming at a different time than we normally have our meeting, and that's great. As you know, my name is John DiMaggio. I'm the chairman of this committee. I work with Morley and Associates, so we'll go around the room. Go ahead.
Kim Omley, I'm Vice President of Public Policy here at the Chamber. Sorry.
I'm Jim Molday with Morley and Associates.
E.C. Braun with Industrial Contractors.
Mike Phelps with R.W. Armstrong.
James Mosley, Environment Kinetics.
Matthew Ballard with Congressman Bucshon.
Ryan Schultz with Counties Don and Don.
Ellen, they'd be a good candidate for Indiana House.
Pepper O'Hara, AT&T.
Jeff Knight with Old National Bank.
Justin Greer.
Congressman Bucshon.
Sally Reinhardt Lambert with Alcoa.
Jerry Eigner with Eigner Construction.
Mark Schmidt, C.H. Robinson.
Ron Summers, also C.H. Robinson. Luke Yeager with Commerce Bank and also chair of the Government Affairs Committee here at the Chamber.
David Matthews, Associates Appraisers.
Ken Newcomb, FC Tucker Commercial.
Kathy Briscoe, FC Tucker, and Vice Chair of the Chamber.
Thank you. All right.
Can we tee it up?
Yes,
This is great.
go ahead.
How many of you, just by show, how many of you were in DC for the fly-in 6 months ago, 9 months ago? I forget when that was. Not many of you. Well, we were in a different position back then. I think there was maybe 40 or 50 people that were part of that, the Southwest Indiana fly-in. And I remember thinking back then how bleak the situation was when we were talking about getting one of these large infrastructure bills to the finish line, and how we were imploring our grassroots, which in fact I represent the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which represents 1,300 local chambers of commerce and businesses of all shapes and sizes. And our true strength is in the local chambers. Nobody wants to hear folks from DC, especially me, who's based in DC, come out here and tell you what to do. And I think the true strength of our organization is working with chambers, and it just so happens that this one is what we call highly accredited with I have more stars than I can possibly imagine when it comes to all the benchmarks you have to hit to be considered a 4-star chamber when it comes to the U.S. But by way of background, I worked on the U.S. Senate for 10 years for Senator Inhofe, and I worked on the Environment and Public Works Committee for members such as Senator Bond and Senator Warner, working on what I call the 4 R's, rivers, inland waterway system, locks and dams, the Army Corps of Engineers, the big WRDA bills, the Water Resource Development Act bills that try and take care of, unfortunately, the 300 locks and dams that are 80 years old and the ports in this country. Rail, the Class 1 railroads, the short line railroads, the way in which we move freight efficiently and effectively throughout the country. Roads, and finally runways, aviation. That those 4 systems all connected. I'm the Director of Congressional Affairs, Director of Transportation Infrastructure at our Congressional Affairs Office. That's the main lobbyist that goes around the country to events like this and lobbies members of Congress. Some need it less than others. They just get it. But I kind of wanted to just tell a little story. I'm going to talk for a little bit, just give you some background. The Federal Highway Program, Highway and Transit Program, was started in 1912, 100 years ago, by William Howard Taft, and it was in recognition of our federal constitutional responsibility to establish a free-flowing network of roads for the purposes of connecting cities. That eventually gave way to the aviation industry, and then in 1956, Eisenhower commissioned the 44,000 miles of interstate road map. Original versions included I-69 and other roads that were not until recently, which is actually a good story we'll talk about in a little bit, that are actually seeing the first 65 miles of 69 as a result. I think, if I'm not mistaken, those are going to be opened up relatively soon from here up at this point.
They're saying mid-November.
Mid-November? Well, still, that's a huge implication, and I'll tell you why on a national level. But the 1956 Commission of Interstate was one of the most prolific growths in U.S. history. Unfortunately, we've kind of relied on a legacy of those investments over the last 50 years. And what we do in Washington, and ever since then, is we charge 18.4 cents in a federal fuel tax, and then every 5 years we figure out how to spend these big bills. Unfortunately, the revenue that we take in hasn't kept pace with the needs, and also to take care of the roads that were built with a 50-year service life and are kind of at the end of their usefulness and are in need of dire need of reconstruction. Well, unfortunately, the last highway bill, in safety law in 2005, expired in 2009, and without a willingness to identify new revenue for a program that many believe had gotten bloated, and I'll tell you. It started with 2 programs in 1956, and it had grown to 109 programs taking care of every constituency, whether it was ferry boats or bike paths. There was behavioral programs about how people drive. You would not believe the things that made it into the tent, so to speak, over the years. So there was an unwillingness to continue the status quo. And that reform had to be a hallmark if we were going to rebrand the federal program back to the American people as something that was nimble and something that was worth investing in. And that was the charge to Congress. And unfortunately, there wasn't much leadership from the administration. There wasn't a reauthorization proposal that was given to Congress that they could work off of, which is traditionally how these big highway bills are done. So unfortunately, we were stuck with 9 extensions over a period of 2.5 years, but luckily, I have a feeling that the firsthand testimony on how that was actually shepherded to the finish line will come in a second. But we were able to pass this bill. We were able to pass a 2-year bill, an extension of the federal highway program that expires in end of fiscal year 2014. It provides $105 billion. It does not add to the deficit. And what those long, big programs do is they give municipalities, states, and the private sector the confidence and the predictability and a revenue stream to begin to build these large infrastructure projects. Unlike the stimulus and the money that was provided by these short extensions, which just lead to paved jobs and simple 2- and 3-month type deals because you don't have the ability to engage in a multi-year, multi-phase project that can cost well over $200 million. Because the way that the federal highway program works is you front the federal government the money, and at the completion of the project, you are reimbursed. And we have serious problems, on as far as infrastructure is concerned. We've lost about 20% of our agriculture market share in the United States to Brazil in the last 2 years. Last year alone, congestion on our nation's roads and bridges, we wasted $130 billion worth of fuel. That's just money that escapes from the environment or from the economy. And so when people tend to look at the structural deficiency or the condition of our roads, that's only one part of the story. The performance has added so much friction cost to the movement of goods and services that in many ways we're no longer competitive with Canada, Asia, and Brazil in our manufacturing industry, which companies that I represent and as many of you know, make business decisions to relocate outside of the United States because it is too expensive to do business here. For a lot of reasons, corporate tax rate, regulatory uncertainty, but primarily it's on the infrastructure basis for major manufacturing. It is too expensive for Caterpillar and Dow and BASF and Siemens to get their products from the middle of the country to the Port of Savannah, Newport News, and the Port of Long Beach. So there is a fundamental problem in Washington where we're chronically underinvested in infrastructure, and bills like this, and I will tell you that when I started talking about that meeting 6 months ago, I was very, both personally and professionally invested in this issue, but I was very pessimistic about us actually getting something to the finish line. The Senate passed a 2-year extension of the program. The House wanted to go with a 5-year bill because that obviously provides more certainty to the market and is a more prudent alternative to a shorter bill because, as you know, states and metropolitan planning organizations plan in 5 and 10 and 20-year budgets. They're capital budgeters, unlike the federal government where we just cash balance every year. We figure how much we have and we juxtapose that against states and localities. And how
Actually,
they-
we don't have a budget.
Yeah, we don't have a budget. We don't have a budget. We just do these spending bills, you know, that keep everything afloat. But the House passed a package which was chock full of environmental streamlining provisions, and I'd say about 20 to 30% of the federal dollars that we spend now in the federal highway program, because of the 89 federal boxes you have to check off to build a project, waste about 20 to 30% of the value. And so conservatives, many of them, which were concerned about continuing to support a program that wasn't accountable, that was too big for its own good, was unwieldy, and was not purposed for the kind of the truly federal projects that were going to help with the export situation. And the reason is you can't help the debt per GDP ratio if our number one export by volume in this country is cardboard and paper that we send back to China so they can send it back to us. We have to fix that. And we have to make ourselves attractive to manufacturing, as it's already starting to do, to relocate back from China and Southeast Asia and India into the United States. And because these projects, these large infrastructure projects, have such a long lead time, and for those that have been working on I-69 for as long as I can remember, you know that these projects don't happen overnight. And that we have to build the foundation with a reformed federal policy that allows the private sector and for states and municipalities to plan in kind. And I think the hallmarks of these bills, which Congress will get to in a second, I would say is the streamlining portion. Right now it takes between 13 years from conception to completion to build a large project, 200 million or above. This program puts hard deadlines, adds I would call it the Red Tape Reduction Act in many ways, you know. And there were several folks that were pivotal in pushing this position. Obviously the Senate, the chairman of the committee was Senator Boxer from California. The conservatives, the Republicans control the House, and they chose conferees in the House and Senate sitting room in the Capitol, and they hash out the bill. There were several people that were chosen. Your representative, Mr. Bucshon, was one of them, where in fact on a table just like this, which was unprecedented in 100 years of the federal program, actual elected members of Congress came and sat down on the other side and negotiated directly with Senate staff. And I remember Senate staff telling me that was extremely difficult to push their position when you actually had the guy with the election certificate striving for the bill. Normally conferences have taken in the past 20 years, 2 to 3 years to actually get done. This one was done in 3 months, 4 months. And I will tell you that there is no, you know, not Congress isn't doing much these days as a result of some of the gridlock and the impasses when bills are actually passed and they stop at the Senate and likewise the White House. But this is the one piece of unfinished business that the chamber has a priority. Unfunded mandates on states and localities, environmental regulations that aren't based on sound science, and a need for tax reform. Those are the things we're pushing for. This, along that plank, is something that we've been pushing for 2-3 years, because we are confident that every dollar that we spend in federal transportation leads to about 30,000 jobs, direct, indirect, induced labor, and returns about $2 to $3 to the economy. Not just now in the short term for the construction guys and the aggregate guys, which are experiencing 22% unemployment, but in the long-term economic health of the country and our ability to compete with the other industrialized nations that are spending 20% of their GDP on infrastructure. With that, I think is kind of just an overview. I would say that, in closing, that there's tremendous opportunity. The Panama Canal in 2014 is expanding, and ships that look like something out of a sci-fi novel. 10,000 TEUs. So right now, those big tankers that are coming in have about 3,000, 4,000 containers on them. 80% of that comes into the port of LA and Long Beach, and then it goes on CSX, Norfolk Southern, UP trains, and comes over to the eastern part of the United States. Extremely expensive. It's becoming more cost prohibitive as the percentage of a cost of goods sold for toilet paper, water, fuel. Transportation used to be about 2% of that. Now it's about 12% of that. It's just making it harder to get things to places, escaped value. Well, what's going to happen around 2015-16 is these ships are going to start coming around the Panama Canal, and they're going to be docking at the ports of New Orleans, coming up the Inland Waterway System, Norfolk, Port of Baltimore, Savannah, and they're going to be traveling on I-64, they're going to be traveling on I-40, and it's going to change the entire dynamic of this region of the United States, the Southeast. and in particular, as things come across straight from Savannah, Norfolk, through Louisville, and then come across this area. So I think that there is a tremendous need and a misunderstanding of how important these kinds of bills are to economic recovery. And I think that I'm extremely privileged and I'm humbled to be invited to these things, to sit next to some of the members of Congress that actually shepherded this thing to the finish line against, mind you, a Republican conference that is not all that big fan of spending big infrastructure bills. So stepping out beyond your comfort zone to govern is something that I think we all should congratulate. But with that being said, I'll turn it over to Mr. Bucshon.
Well, thank you, and thanks for inviting me. And what I'll do is I'll briefly go over some of the things that I see as positives for Indiana that came out of this process. And I think a lot of people deserve credit for shepherding this through. Ultimately, I think it came down to Chairman Micah and Chairman Boxer and the leadership members, Speaker Boehner and Senator Reid and others, that were able to break the partisan gridlock in Washington, D.C. on behalf of infrastructure, recognizing the fact that how important this is to our country. And I think they deserve credit for that. I think that it was surprising to me that when you normally how this works, and you've been on the Senate side, is that most of the actual negotiating is done at the staff level, and direct member involvement is unusual, unheard of in some honestly. But I think the people like myself and other members of my class, Jim Langford, Reed Ribble, Steve Sutherland, us four primarily, and others, felt like if we were going to get a good product, we had to be directly involved in the negotiations. I think doing that really, I think it has changed maybe a little precedent in Washington, D.C. that future conferences will have more direct member involvement. I had just assumed that that's the way it was, you know, that the actual person representing people, you all would be there, and so we were. And I do think that made a big difference ultimately. And we were really surprised by the response of the Senate staff when we showed up, both sides, honestly. But ultimately, it was leadership that I think that helped break the cycle. And let me just go over a few highlights and then take some questions. You know, for the state of Indiana, we're doing well funding-wise. We're going to receive the same level of funding. Fiscal year 13 we did in 12, and then in year 2 we'll receive a 1 or 2% funding increase, consistent with every other state, which is unusual because normally that increase would be potentially different for every state, and the state of Indiana has been historically disadvantaged in that process, getting less return on the amount of dollars we contribute to the Highway Trust Fund. In fact, as late as the 1980s, we got less than 80% of our Highway Trust Fund dollars back to our state. Most recently, 92%. But in 2014, with this current bill, the second year of the bill, we'll get approximately 97% of our funds back from our contribution to the Highway Trust Fund. There was some language in the bill that we were successfully able to remove regarding public-private partnerships, which would have cost Indiana about $40 million a year. And that was a successful thing. It was really put in there by Senator Bingaman and Durbin on the Senate side because they basically don't like private sector involvement in federal projects. That's the bottom line. But I think everybody recognized that P3s, public-private partnerships, I think are an essential tool to have in your toolbox with the funding challenges that you described and that we know we have when it comes to funding our infrastructure. For the state of Indiana, you may know that the RV industry is really very, very sizable in the northern part of the state, around Elkhart in that area. And there were some weight exemptions that were already being given to city buses and over-the-road motor coaches, which were very important to them. We were able to get that done for the state, because that is gonna make a big difference in their ability to produce RVs that are not cost prohibitive for people to buy. And you wouldn't think it'd be a big issue. It's a huge issue, because the increased emission standards were making it difficult for them to get everything they needed on the RV vehicles. This makes a difference. For agriculture, this area is obviously big in agriculture. We were able to change where farm vehicles are allowed to travel. It used to be within 100 miles of their property, limited to the state. So if you had a farm right on the state line, you may not be able to go across your farm vehicle into the other state. I mean and there's a lot of people around here, of course, that have property in both Illinois and Kentucky and Indiana. We changed that to a 150-mile radius. We had to remove the in-state provision, which for agriculture is a fairly sizable deal. The streamlining that was discussed, we put in place deadlines. For example, slow-moving projects, the Secretary of DOT needs to sets deadlines to make sure all approvals occur within 4 years. And after the 4 years have elapsed, agencies that have permitting still pending start to lose funding, automatic funding by missing deadlines. So it puts pressure on agencies to, like the EPA and others, to come up with to get the projects approved or disapproved, whichever the case may be. Also, the environmental review process for projects that are only going to get $5 million or less of federal funding. There is a categorical exclusion to that they don't have to participate in the NEPA process, the federal process, as long as it's approved in their states. That's a big deal, because there's a lot of projects that are relatively small that will avoid years, literally, of red tape from Washington, D.C. So this is a big deal. There was no provision like this in current law. Also, categorical exclusion for projects in right-of-way, which means if you're going to replace something that's already in an approved right-of-way. Rulemaking, there's a 180-day deadline for the Secretary of DOT to classify these projects within the existing operational right-of-way as an exclusion. So they have to decide up or down quickly, because rather than years and years of, and this makes total sense. If you already have, everything's already established and you need to replace something in a right-of-way, they should be able to approve that quickly. And for projects destroyed by disaster, again, 180-day deadline to have them approved as a categorical exclusion. The example is the bridge in Minnesota, which was, this can be done. These agencies can act. That bridge was rebuilt in 437 days, I think it was. And they didn't skip any of the process. The process just worked efficiently and effectively. And so it can be done. You can complete a federal project quickly if you get these agencies to act. This forces them, under situations like that, to act more quickly. And in state law standing in for federal law, on which state laws provide the same level of protection under federal law when it comes to the environmental process, which means if states have criteria that are at or exceed the federal criteria, you can avoid the feds, essentially. If you're not consistent with or exceeding federal, then you'll still have to go through that process. Gives the states more flexibility in using their money for projects unrelated to what I call projects that move people, things, or products, which means beautification projects and bicycle paths and other things. States can use their money for that if they want, but this gives them the flexibility if they decide at the state level that they have more pressing infrastructure issues. It gives them more flexibility to use more of their federal money for the way they see fit, which is a big deal. We tried to eliminate the federal mandate completely. My feeling is that the states should have the ability to to use if they want to use all the money for those type of projects, that's their prerogative. If they don't want to use any of it, previously you had to use 10% of your money for these other projects, and so sometimes states didn't have the flexibility they needed. And then it consolidates a number of highway programs by 2/3 and eliminates dozens of programs, as you talked about, making resources available and more flexible to the states. And one last thing we did put on there for veterans. There will be significant changes to the CDL licensing for veterans alive and their military driving experience to help fast track their CDL license. This is a big deal because right now the trucking industry and others that require, are having significant problems acquiring qualified drivers. And the CDL, commercial driver's license stepping stone is a bigger one than you might think. And there are people that are coming out of the military right now that have been driving trucks in the military and that's what they do. And they already have essentially a CDL. This helps streamline that. And there's a number of other things. I think the biggest thing is that rather than doing extensions, this does provide at least 2 years of known funding for federal projects. We wanted, and I wanted a longer bill, 5 years. The reality is there wasn't money to do that. I mean, the stepping stone to getting this done is in our current environment, the finances to fund a 5-year bill. And that was very difficult. The buying power of the federal gas tax is about 11 cents compared to the 18.4 cents that it was in 1993. That's a challenge. More fuel efficient cars, less money coming into the highway trust fund. That's a challenge. So I think, going forward, a few things are going to be big challenges to us. Finding more funding, and there are a lot of ideas out there about that. I think it was also an education process for the American people. I mean, I talk to people all the time, and very few people know what the 18.4 cents a gallon is used for. They just assume it's a general tax that's supposed to go just to pay for whatever the federal government wants to do. And to a certain extent, there was a little bit of truth to that when it came to projects that got tacked on to, being able to get trust fund money, as it was discussed. But now we've tightened that up. So I think part of our charge is for infrastructure is to educate people about where the federal dollars are being spent and what they're being spent on, and then make sure that we spend them on the things that we need. I usually equate it to being at your kitchen table, going over your budget for the year. There's things you have to have. There's things that there's things you would like to have if you have the money, and there's things, boy, you'd really love to have that if you have the money. And right now, the federal government's in that situation. We need to make sure that the things we have to have are funded. The things we'd like to have, find novel ways to help fund those. And the things, in my view, that are things that we just can't afford, we're going to have to tell the American people we can't afford it. And infrastructure is no different. I am one that believes in the federal highway program. I do think the federal government has a significant role in funding transportation infrastructure projects as a base role of the federal government to ensure that we have the appropriate infrastructure in place for our commerce, not only just for us to travel recreationally, but for our commerce. In that vein, I'm also co-sponsor on a bill by Charles Bustani that addresses the money that comes in at our ports that's paid by the people that use our ports, and making sure that money is directed to upgrading our ports. Believe it or not, most of the money has been directed in other directions, and now we're at a point where with the Panama Canal expansion, there's only a few ports in the United States that can take the large container ships, and most of our ports right now have to take ships partially full, which is a limiting factor in commerce. So we need to make sure we're using the money in that trust fund, the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, it's called, appropriately, and we haven't been. And the reality is it's been diverted to all kinds of different projects. So that's another transportation issue, and I'm sure you're aware. Bruce Downey's, what he's trying to do, he's from Louisiana, represents Louisiana, and so it's important to him for obvious reasons. And it would be helpful to us because we're right on the in on the waterway, and we want to make sure that the Port of New Orleans can handle bigger container ships and continue to handle those, and that's a challenge. So with that, that lead in, I think.
Sure. Okay, any specific questions or general questions that you have about MAP 21, about some of the things that were changed in the new program? Yes, go ahead, Dick.
John, I think you started off by saying if you want economic development, improve your infrastructure. We have two basic needs right now. We need more jobs. We need better infrastructure. Building roads does both of those things. So we've had this issue about 18.4% or 18.4 cent gas tax for a long time. We've all heard about that. If you were to raise that 6 cents, you would increase funding by a third, which would only increase the cost of gas by 2% or less. Matter of fact, that 6 cents probably would disappear in the market fluctuations in a month. Now, if you would grumble about it, but it seems so obvious to do that. We just lack courage maybe in somebody bringing that forward. And I think you've got a lot of courage. You've displayed that. So what's keeping you from bringing it up?
I think across Congress right now, there's and it's bipartisan. No one wants to, in general, raise taxes. I think that would be I think it's unfortunate in 1993 that it wasn't indexed to inflation or GDP growth or something. That said, I think that, so right now it'd be a very heavy lift to get that done.
But next January,
it may or may not be, depending on the situation and the changes. And it's not a partisan issue either. This is a bipartisan issue when it relates to that. You have to recognize there are some people that want to completely eliminate the federal highway program altogether. And that's bipartisan also, not just one side or the other. So it's a pretty significant challenge to get that. But your point about needing to have more revenue and invest in our infrastructure is valid. And I think everybody recognizes that. And our challenge is to find common ground and make that happen. So, right, I think, again, it's unfortunate in 93, I think that it wasn't indexed to inflation. That would have helped. And why that wasn't, I wasn't around, I don't know.
How many people in this room knew that the federal gas tax was 18.4 cents? I always like to ask that. So, I mean, that's part of the problem is that people don't know what they're paying.
Well, I think historically also, like raising on the tax issue, I asked this question when I talked to people in town hall meetings and stuff. Who feels like they're getting value from the federal tax dollar right now? Does anybody? Anybody in the room feel the combination of cost and benefit, benefit of your federal tax dollar? And this is consistent with everybody I talk to, that no one raises their hand, and the reason is because of what we've talked about, diversion historically of trust fund dollars for other purposes, diversion of Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund dollars for other purposes. I didn't do that, but historically the government has done that, and it just needs to stop. And so most of the American people right now, no matter which side of the aisle you're on, don't have confidence, in my view, for the most part, except for the administration, that honestly that people want to see more taxation. They don't, because you have to restore the first thing you have to do is restore the confidence that your tax dollar, you're getting value for your tax dollar. If we can restore that, it'll be helpful. And education is part of that. Like you just said, and I said earlier in my comments, most people don't realize what federal gas tax is used for. They just assume it goes into everything else. And they've got valid reasons to believe that. And that's the process. Us that care about transportation have to turn that around. And then at the federal level, we have to show people that the money is going to be used for what it's supposed to be used for.
Bridges to nowhere, sidewalks, things that have marked this program don't instill a lot of faith.
They
you
don't.
know?
And it's been on both sides. I mean,
Yeah.
so.
Which is gone, by the way. That's the whole thing, is you have to, if you're gonna ask people to raise a gas tax, which 8, 9 years ago, the US Chamber is behind raising the gas tax, but we also recognize that the first step was reforming the program. You can't put more money into a program that's wasting, that has administrative expenses that are out of control, where they're forcing states on a 3% mandate, that 3% of all the money they have has to be spent on bike paths and rails to trails and recreational stuff. All that stuff's gone now. So the first step was consolidating the program, rebranding it as something that's actually a good federal program, that's a primary federal responsibility, and then we can move from there, you know?
Well, I heard a presentation recently about lobbying for an alternative to the gas tax because of the compressed natural gas and alternatively fueled vehicles and the better gas mileage. And making a really compelling argument that no matter what you raise the gas tax to, even if it was indexed, it's not going to keep up to pace. And then
That may very well be true. I don't think there's going to be anything happen with that for certain before the next Congress. I mean, it's not, but in the next highway bill, some of those things may be addressed. I don't know. We'll have to see. I mean, I think, again, the first step is, I think, educating the American people on, first of all, our infrastructure needs, how they're funded, and showing them through reforms like this in this bill that they're going to get value for their dollar. And then, we have 2 years to, really probably a year to get that message out, and then discuss where we go as a country funding our infrastructure.
I think that that there hasn't been leadership on this issue in a long time. And I think that we've just kind of, since 2005, we passed these big bills that had earmarks in them, they kind of just happened. Now we actually have to push these things up a hill and explain why the largest non-defense spending bill that Congress puts together is worth it. And I think for us at the U.S. Chamber, and someone that worked on Capitol Hill for a while, we actually have those leaders now. We call them the House Four, the members that Mr. Bucshon mentioned earlier, that were actually negotiating on the other side of the table. Chairman Micah, my former boss, Senator Inhofe. You have a collection of people that get it and are now recognizing and explaining to their colleagues, and many on a conversation that's somewhat difficult, that this issue is worth fighting for. We're just gonna have to figure out a way to pay for it. You know.
Well, and in the presentation, the compelling argument was made, but they didn't offer a solution.
Well, you have to sell it to the people, because what you're talking about is mileage-based user fees, or a way bill tax, or there's 30 different options. The problem is it splits everyone differently, and the question is, you're going to have to sell it. You have to sell it to the American people before you begin to talk about it.
It won't go in.
You know.
Yeah, but also what you might think about is the money that is in this tax fund, the highway fund, they haven't been spending on highways. Is that what you're saying?
A percentage of it, 10% at a minimum.
See, that's
Some states have spent, which is their prerogative, more than 10%. You couldn't spend less than 10% on projects that, like I said, don't move people, products or other things. And that, I was in favor of eliminating that federal mandate, allowing states the flexibility to spend none or all of their money on that if they wanted, as long within certain criteria that they had to maintain their interstate highways and things like that. I mean, that's not open-ended. There was a lot of money, specifically in emergency situations. Part of a bill that I introduced that changed it in the face of an emergency, and that kind of spurred on by the bridge in Louisville, got included in the bill, which would let, in the case of an emergency, like an infrastructure emergency, the state could use all their money to help rebuild, rather than the mandate would not apply. Of course, there's pushback on that from the other people who are stakeholders on the other side of that issue. But I want to make clear that states still have the ability to use money that they want to use on these projects. This did not, in contrast to what some people say, eliminate the ability of states to spend money on all these other projects. They can. they don't want to.
Yeah.
They just don't have to, they just don't always have to spend 10%. Yeah.
Does this federal money you're talking about come back to the counties, federal money for the highway departments in there?
Well, ultimately it does through your state DOTs and others.
Because I think one problem, I know in our county, we all fight a budget, and they line their budget up, and then all at once, in June, they decide they're gonna get another $1 million, which is a lot for
Yeah.
some counties. And that happened in our county this year. And I think when that happens, then the politicians there decide fighting over where the money goes, and we don't spend it wisely. You know, who gets the road blacktop? I mean, it gets right down to trying to please people.
Primarily it's through state DOTs.
Yeah. But I mean, that goes right down to local level now.
Well,
If you know we're gonna get the money, you're
right,
saying.
you'd have to get the money from your State Department of Transportation. You know, it's gotta filter down.
You mentioned an important word earlier, branding, and I kind of liken this issue from a macro level to education. You know, we all get really upset when we see, oh, we're falling behind X, Y, or Z in test scores or this, that, and the other, and that tends to rally the nation because we're all competitive at heart. And you know, the example you used was the fact that we might be falling behind countries like Canada or Brazil. And obviously they're making these investments. I mean, we heard an economist yesterday at a BKD presentation talk about how in Brazil, every square inch of ground is being planted with soybeans and corn. And so that agricultural competition is real. But who's responsible really for this branding effort? Because it's going to take, I think, a national branding effort of making it transparent to the average citizen why this issue is so important to start to fuel politicians like you, Larry, who've kind of been out on the forefront of this, but to start to step forward and say, okay, this is something that is important to my constituents. I mean, right now it's a non-issue because of that lack of education. So my question is, who's responsible for that branding effort, and is it the U.S. Chamber who starts to invest dollars on running those statistics?
Well, we've been pushing it for 8 years, but I will tell you that in this fiscal environment, pushing large spending bills through Congress is very difficult. And I was and someone that worked for one of the more conservative members of the Senate for a long time. House Republicans made a decision very early on, about 2 years ago, that this was going to be one of their priorities. And I think that it sometimes I always talk about there's two kinds of problems. There's black swans. That's like World War I, Katrina, hurricanes. You can't plan for them. Then we have something called wicked problems. They're so complex and people don't know how to figure them out, so they just avoid them. I was extremely impressed because it was not easy stepping out and taking tremendous risk and saying, this is a big spending bill and we need it, and that it's critical for the country. So I think that although this is a good story to tell, and I think that I'm excited now to travel around and then to get to muster our resources to continue to make the case that Congress, that this is what they should be doing, and this is what they are doing, and this is what they have done. And we have a reform program that I think we can be proud of. But I like handing out these summaries and showing everything that we did, plank by plank by plank, and saying this is something that if we were to raise the gas tax, or we were to raise just the diesel tax, or if we were to have a way bill fee, or if we were to use customs user fees, or if we were going to charge a tax on containers, if we were going to refocus it just to the interstates, these are things that I think people will begin to be sold on. So.
How do we reduce the environmental bureaucracy? It seems that drags us down. It drags our thought process down, that everything has to be drug out. Everything has to be extended. Every project that you want to get done, that it just adds months and months and months to the project. And you start off of course, as an engineer, I'm a designer. We start off knowing the rules, trying to follow the rules, but the bureaucracy, the environmental bureaucracy, it's a whole thing unto itself, and it just adds tremendous amount of dollars. And if we're trying to protect the environment, certainly at the beginning of a project design, that's what we try to do, and we make that a part of it. But we can't get through the bureaucracy in any sort of speedy manner. Nobody responds in a quick manner that, look, yeah, okay, you got it done, here's your approval. It can't be done that way. It has to be done with months and months of delay and no response and no communication.
Well, I think this goes, some of the things I mentioned in streamlining will help, where agencies have to respond, or they start to lose funding. You know, I think that was one of the big issues, and, you know, honestly, to a certain extent, to Barbara Boxer's willingness to work with us on that, even though the environmentalists honestly were running ads against her in California. You know, I think she stepped out of her comfort zone. I think her preference wouldn't have been to do some of these streamlinings, but recognized ultimately, based on input from people like yourself and others, that there was this, we had gone in a direction that was too far to one direction, and try to find common ground and move it back to what I would call a common sense approach. And so I think you will see that the process should be improved. And here's the thing, these changes are not just in this bill, and the next time we're going to have to fight for them again. These are reforms that in the baseline for the next highway bill will come out from this. So, you know, I think this is a good ground, you know, good baseline to start working from, to you know, work together with environmental groups and find common ground so we can move projects forward. I think we made some significant progress here. I mean, I hear from everybody the same thing about the years and years of delays. And, you know, nothing in, again, nothing in what we've done changes, you know, will change the fact that these projects have to be reviewed to be environmentally sound, which I agree with. But what it does is it forces agencies to act and move forward rather than delay projects for years. So I think there's some significant advances in this budget.
I think one kind of to follow on that too is one of the challenges that you have on any major project is anybody can file a lawsuit in a lot of these challenges to projects. The burden of proof actually gets stuck on the person doing the project, not the person who's objecting to the project, in terms of what they view as harm or problematic or whatever the case may be. They can file a lawsuit, tie something up in the courts a long time outside of the regulatory agency.